I'm Sara Forsyth, and this is Ashley Charlebois. I'm one of the physicians that works here in sports medicine, and Ashley's a registered dietitian here, specializing in sports nutrition. So we're going to talk about relative energy deficiency in sport. I'm going to go first, and then Ashley's going to do her part of the presentation, which will have some great case examples and be sort of a practical approach to increasing energy intake. If you have any questions, just ask as we go along. Can I talk a bit louder? Sure. Okay. Actually, before we get started, how many people in the room are coaches? Okay, great, thank you. And physicians? Good. And anything else? Anybody else? Not coaching?
Just I've taken some coaching courses,
okay.
But I don't actually coach anybody.
Great.
Yeah.
Glad to have you here. Okay. Okay. So relative energy deficiency in sport is a relatively new term. It used to be called the female athlete triad. It was originally talked about, discovered, defined in 1992. And it was thought to be three very separate entities. The first one, disordered eating, amenorrhea or lack of menstrual periods, and osteoporosis. And it was most commonly observed in young female athletes in sports that emphasized a lean physique. As the time moved on and there's more research done, some of the definitions softened and they looked at it more as on a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum was optimal health, so normal menstrual periods, optimal energy availability, and optimal bone health. And then moving along to the pathological end with frank osteoporosis, amenorrhea, and low energy availability, or with or without a frank eating disorder. This was a move in the right direction because it allowed earlier identification. So earlier identification of people that weren't, athletes that weren't at the one end of the pathological spectrum. And that's a good place to identify this disorder because it's a bit easier to deal with. It also identifies the fact that there's sort of a area in there in the middle that's subclinical, so it might not be that obvious to the athlete, parents, coaches, doctors, what's going on. So then some consensus statements came out. 2014, we had two things come out that this is where we moved to the term relative energy deficiency in sport. And what this new term identified is that really, even though these are interrelated entities, it's the energy deficiency that is the underpinning and sort of leads to the rest of the problems. You can't see that very well, but what this slide demonstrates is that the IOC Consensus Statement, they have two of these diagrams. One of them, this one, talks about the physiological effects of relative energy deficiency. And then there's another one that talks about performance. But the reason I want to include this is it shows how small the triad piece really is. And all those dots, which you can't see the writing in, talk about all the other effects, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. So just to summarize for a sec, the changing in terminology achieved three things. First, it allows for earlier recognition. And then secondly, it broadened the breadth of the impact of the syndrome. And third, it talks about the effect on performance, which was a new piece to this, which I'll go into in a bit. So some myths I'm gonna introduce with. So the effects of the female athlete triad are restricted to menstruation and bone. And the athlete's performing optimally, so there's no need for concern. So we know this isn't true because the low energy availability impairs physiologic function, including the metabolic rate, which is decreased to preserve body mass and essential functions. There's a carbohydrate deficiency that leads to reduction in glucose utilization and decreased mobilization of fat stores. We'll talk more about the menstrual function and bone health. Immunity, there's increased risk of infection, illness, chronic fatigue. And we know now that with just a very small energy deficit, there's implication for protein synthesis, which of course affects muscle development, recovery, and performance. In terms of cardiovascular health, there's unfavorable lipid profile and dysfunction of the endothelium, increasing cardiovascular risk factors. And then of course mood disturbance, which is a little bit hard to nail down specifically, but we know when there's energy deficiency, there's mood disturbance, and sometimes it's hard to know which came first. So this is a slide with regards to performance. The performance effects of relative energy deficiency. So decrease response to training, decrease or increased risk of injury, impaired judgment, decreased coordination, kind of things that aren't that intuitive, decreased concentration, irritability, depression, the mental health piece. So this is good that this is included, and hopefully it'll gain more momentum, because I think this really brings it home for the athletes. This is what sort of makes it mean something for them, is if it's going to affect their performance. Because sometimes, especially in adolescence, talking about physiology and menstrual function and bone health, it's not that real to them. But the performance piece is. Okay, I don't need to worry about my athlete because the female athlete triad is rare. Well, we know that's not true. Some US data shows that up to 78% of high school female athletes have at least one component of the triad. And the prevalence is 2 to 3 times higher in lean sports as opposed to non-lean sports. In males, it's significantly higher in gravitational sports such as ski jumping and endurance type sports where excess body weight is associated with a competitive advantage. So now I'm going to go through each piece just in a bit more detail and to do some definitions and management. So energy availability, the amount of energy available for all body functions after accounting for energy expended from exercise and physical activity. And that's the last equation that I'm going to do, but Ashley will be including more complicated things. But basically, it's energy intake minus the total expenditure is what you're left with. So if the total energy expenditure is equal to intake, we're in energy balance. So the weight should be stable. But when the expenditure exceeds the energy availability, we have this relative energy deficit in sport. So if an athlete is normal weight range, then they must be okay. And she hasn't lost a bunch of weight, so there's probably no need for concern. So we know both of these, we now know both of these are not true. So energy availability must meet energy needs for basic physiologic processes. So when there's a relative energy deficit, the body perceives crisis, and your body will conserve calories by decreasing the resting metabolic rate. So the weight will stay the same. It will put other physiological functions aside to maintain this calorie balance and maintain weight. So we know that lots of amenorrheic athletes actually are a normal weight and haven't lost a significant amount of weight. So weight does not accurately reflect energy state, and when we are in the negative balance, the resting metabolic rate comes down.
Low EA? What's EA meaning that?
Energy availability. So, next myth, only athletes with diagnosed eating disorders don't eat enough. She eats a ton and loves food, so she must be fine. So how do we get into this situation with athletes where they have a relative energy deficit? So some athletes have some abnormal eating behaviors, and I'll talk about some of the things to watch out for in a minute. They do try to maintain a dietary restraints for lean or aesthetic sports, and then other abnormal eating behaviors like binge eating, eating in secret, and even non-vomiting, purging behaviors. And then some athletes just inadvertently are not eating enough for their energy expenditure. And then others, of course, will have frank eating disorder. And it's important to understand that the energy expenditure is very high, and some smaller athletes actually have very high resting metabolic rates. So actually their caloric needs are much higher than one would imagine. And sometimes it's really hard for them to eat enough to meet their needs. So just hi.
This is a female triad?
Yes, come on in. Okay, so how do we diagnose energy deficiency? When body weight's not particularly low, we need more information about exactly what they're eating and what their energy expenditure is required. And Ashley's going to talk more about this in detail. I'm going to leave it. Okay, so just summarizing energy availability, body weight, I guess the main take home is body weight is not an accurate reflection of energy balance, because the body, when it's in crisis, will preserve weight, decrease the resting metabolic rate to preserve essential functions. So menstrual dysfunction, this is another good reflection in the right direction of the softening of the definitions in the Triad, because there's lots of subclinical menstrual dysfunction that occurs in athletes, not just amenorrhea. So eumenorrhea is basically normal menstrual cycle. Oligomenorrhea is irregular, less frequent menstrual cycle, and commonly this is subclinical and that people don't really notice it, but with oligomenorrhea, most of the time they are anovulatory and their bone health isn't optimized. Primary amenorrhea is when there's no period by age 15, and secondary is when they had their period at one point but subsequently lost it and have missed more than 3 consecutive months or have less than 3 cycles per year. So just a little review of how the menstrual cycle works. So basically the low energy availability disrupts the magnitude and the frequency of the pulses needed to stimulate a normal menstrual cycle. So starting at the hypothalamus to the pituitary, releasing LH and FSH, which stimulate estrogen and progesterone production. Very simplistically, the energy availability disrupts the signals between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So exercise makes women lose their periods, and it's normal for serious athletes to not get regular periods. And I think we've all heard those comments in the past, but we now know that's not true. So basically, with the menstrual cycle, it's the low energy availability. Again, this is the underpinning of all the disruption in physiologic function. Some exercise stress and low body fat stores lead to disruption of the menstrual cycle. So moving on to just looking at the bone health a little bit more. So no need to worry, her bone mineral density was fairly normal, and the doctor said she doesn't have osteoporosis. Even though she's had a few stress fractures, her bone mineral density is still normal, so it's all good. So bone health in and of itself can be considered on a spectrum. So it's not just about osteoporosis, but we know that there's alteration in structure, content, and the mineral density when the proper hormones and coupling mechanisms are not working properly. We measure bone health using a bone density measure, DEXA, and basically there's a lot of a few different protocols for who should we order a bone mineral density on, but in general terms, if a woman has had amenorrhea for 6 months or more, we usually order one. And I'll go in a little bit to the sites where we order them at the different age groups. So bone is dynamic tissue. It's always regenerating itself and breaking down. There should be a balance between the osteoblasts that produce new bone cells and osteoclasts that break down bone. And osteoblasts and osteoclasts respond to a variety of signals. So osteoblasts are stimulated by force. This can be gravitational force with running, jumping, weight-bearing sports. And it can also be forced by pulling muscle or pulling of tendon on a bone. And that's where the resistance exercise piece comes in. But I'll go into it a little bit more in a minute, but we know that actually the advantage that you'd think an athlete would get from the weight bearing or the resistance exercise, they're not getting those bone health benefits because the hormones aren't in place and that coupling mechanism of the osteoblast and osteoclast isn't working properly. The age of maximum bone accrual is between 11 and 19, so this is a critical time to catch these girls if they're having menstrual dysfunction in their adolescent years, because we don't really think that that can be reversed in any way. Once they're past that, if they didn't accrue the bone in that critical time, you can't change that when they're adults or when they get their period back or normalize their energy intake. So the gains made in adolescence modified by lifestyle, genetics, physical activity, and nutrition. So I sort of already talked about this. Low energy availability leads to hormonal disruption that results in suppressed bone formation and increased bone resorption. So it's estimated that in the amenorrheic state, girls will continue to lose 2 to 3% of bone mass per year. And again, the osteogenic effects of estrogen or the osteogenic effects of exercise and weight-bearing sport are not, that you don't get those benefits if the appropriate hormones aren't working properly. Another thing that has come out in the last few years is that estrogen aside, we used to think estrogen, the low estrogen, was really the key factor in the bone health issue, but now it's been found that actually low energy availability is an independent risk factor for poor bone health. And this is thought to be through suppression of IGF-1, which is an osteogenic factor. So again, the low bone mass that we see in athletes with a reduced energy deficiency may be due to lack of accrual or the accelerated bone loss due to decreased energy availability and the decreased estrogen. And there's just a correlation between the degree of menstrual dysfunction and the bone mineral density. And we know that stress fractures occur more frequently in active females with menstrual irregularities. Okay, so risk factors for reduced energy deficiency in sport. So one thing to watch out for is sometimes girls, as they go into adolescence and their bodies start to change, they'll start restricting food groups. You know, I don't eat meat, I don't eat dairy, I don't eat eggs, that sort of thing. So sometimes that can be a risk factor to watch out for, that something's coming down the pipes. Psychosocial pressure for thinness, low self-esteem or poor family dynamics, and participation in lean aesthetic sports. So warning signs, decline in performance, which we talked about before with that spoke type figure. Weight loss, which we know they don't always have weight loss, but it is a warning sign. Changes in mood, recurrent illness or injury, dissatisfaction with their appearance, delayed menarche, so the low energy availability can delay the initial period, that's what menarche is, and subclinical menstrual dysfunction. So for screening, as I've mentioned, the earlier the better. These can happen at pre-participation physicals or at regular doctor visits. There's different screening tools, but just screening for components of recurrent injury, fatigue. If their performance is declining, we should be asking questions around energy deficiency, and if they're finding that they're not recovering from their training sessions. And then just having coaches and parents have increased awareness of what to be looking out for. In the Female Athlete Triad Coalition pre-participation tool, which is available on their website, and I have it at the end of my presentation, they have some different questionnaires and things to watch out for. They have 12 screening questions and then a more in-depth guide that's on their website and part of their consensus statement. Just to go back one more thing, there's other pre-participation, pre-season physical education and history tools that are around through the IOC and different sporting groups, and more of them are putting in female athlete triad screening questions, which is great. This slide is just the initial screening questions that are through the Female Athlete Triad Coalition Consensus Statement. Most of them we've talked about, so if they've ever had their period, and how old were they, just going through, and then asking about birth control pills, if they're worrying about their weight, so looking for eating disorder, disordered eating type behavior, and then looking for the bony stress injuries, or frank low bone density, osteopenia, osteoporosis. In terms of medical evaluation, obviously an accurate menstrual history, including age and menarche, and then looking to see if they've been in the pill or depot or other causes of amenorrhea, and then if they've ever had the stress fracture, and if there's a family history of osteoporosis or eating disorder, and then looking for physical signs of low energy deficiency and low estrogen, so lanugo, and orthostatic hypotension, and then other signs of more pathological eating disorders, such as bulimia and that sort of thing. So in terms of lab work, we do a basic, first of all, rule out pregnancy, that would be the #1 thing, and then a basic hormonal profile. And then sometimes we do a progesterone challenge, but I can't say particularly often. You usually get your answer earlier on before you get there. And if you're worried about PCOS or an outlet obstruction, if it's a primary amenorrhea, then a pelvic ultrasound. Bone mineral density. So again, usually as a general rule, if there's amenorrhea greater than 6 months, and for a child, adolescent and growing child, we use spine and whole body minus head. And then for women, it's spine and hip. The 2007 American Academy of Sports Medicine, they recommend different cutoffs for concern. So they're saying a Z-score of -1. Plus high stress injury, bony stress injury is cause for concern, because they think that these kids should have really high bone density compared to in terms of a Z-score. So they think the normals should be different for athletes. So management, multidisciplinary team, of course, physician with an interest in the area or some training in doing some of the evaluation, a sports dietitian, depending on how the energy deficiency developed, mental health professional, and getting everybody on the same page is really important, that the athlete doesn't feel that they're being ganged up upon and made to eat. So engagement of the parents, coaches, and therapeutic alliance. So the main goal is to normalize energy status and restore weight, which will result in resumption of menses. So even though we said that in general the weight is very often normal, we know that basically the Number one indicator of success will be some gaining of weight. And the research in anorexic patients shows that the weight gain to restore menstrual status, it's not really that much. It's between 2 and 5% of their body weight. And in anorexic studies, that has to be fat mass, but in athletes, for some reason, it can be fat-free mass weight gain. So addressing the underlying cause, so again, if it's inadvertent versus advertent energy or intake restriction, and strategies for increasing energy availability require input of a specialized nutrition expert. There's a lot of complicated calculations, and you can do some lab measurements to get the resting metabolic rate and to very specifically calculate the actual energy output. So what kind of time frame are we looking at? The restoration of the energy status will happen within days to weeks. And as they start getting enough calories to cover off their expenditure, those physiologic adaptations that happen to accommodate for the energy deficiency will reverse quite quickly. The menstrual status, the time it takes is dependent on how severe it was, whether it was amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea, and how long it had been going on for. But usually it's a few months or more, up to a year. And then recovery of bone mineral density depends when the amenorrhea was and when the menstrual disturbance was. And some, as I mentioned earlier, some of it's not reversible. Pharmacological management is very rare. They talk about referral to an endocrinologist for some different types of hormonal replacement if there's no response to non-pharmacological management at 1 year and further bony stress injury. Antidepressants might be indicated if it's a frank eating disorder. And then talking about the use of oral contraceptive pill doesn't work. And it can also do a couple things. It can mask the ongoing amenorrhea, so you never have a clinical endpoint if you're bringing on a period with the oral contraceptive pill. And now, it's not even that recent. I mean, there were studies quite a long time ago, but they're coming out more and more now that they think that the oral contraceptive pill might actually hinder the stimulation of osteoblasts and hinder that coupling mechanism. And they think, again, that's through the first pass effect of the oral contraceptive pill through the liver, inhibiting IGF-1, which is an osteogenic factor. There's some other talk of transdermal estrogen replacement with cyclic progesterone, but obviously you'd have to use a lot of caution in adolescent. Okay, so clearance and return to play. The 2014 papers that came out from the IOC and the Female Athlete Triad Coalition were the first to look at clearance and return to play. And the coalition paper uses a risk stratification tool. They stratify them into, oops, oh no. Hold on, sorry. I tried to make it so I could actually see it here. Okay, hold on. Good, okay. So low, moderate, and high risk. They talk about the degree of energy availability, disordered eating versus eating disorder, low BMI or the state of the BMI, whether it's less than 17.5 or greater than 18.5 or 19, I think. Delayed menarche versus just menstrual dysfunction, low bone density, and then versus a bone stress reaction or fracture. So the reason they use this risk stratification, well, one thing is to make it very clear cut for coaches and parents and physicians. but they know there's a dose-response relationship between the magnitude of the components and the impact on bone health and susceptibility to fracture. And this is really important during a period of rapid growth, because in adolescence, the linear growth exceeds the mineralization of the bone, so the bone is at high risk of sort of catastrophic injury. So I'll have the link for where you can find the stratification tool, but low risk are usually fully cleared to return. Moderate risk, they have provisional clearance with an agreement of compliance with recommendations from a team of the dietitian, physician, coach. And then high risk are restricted from training and competition due to the risk of fracture. Provisional, if it's determined the athlete is determined to reach the goals, and then they have a copy of a treatment contract that outlines the criteria for future clearance. So the main messages I wanted to get across tonight were that it's really important that the female athlete triad is not an inevitable consequence of training hard and being a fantastic athlete and being healthy. It can be prevented, and it's important to prevent it. Coaches, parents, and trainers need to educate women about, and those other involved in their training and medical care, about the requirement for optimal energy intake, energy balance, and fuel, and that body weight doesn't always reflect that. And the optimal goal is to make sure that the female athletes stay healthy from a young age, young sports specialization, all the way through to adulthood. And I think part of this is, and part of these consensus statements coming out in a more comprehensive way last year, was to try to get national and international sport bodies to talk more about the need to develop policies and eliminate harmful weight loss practices for lean and aesthetic sports. And these are the resources I talked about. So the Female Athlete Triad Coalition website has a lot of resources. It's got handouts, it's got the IOC paper and some other papers. It's got information for parents, coaches. It's got the pre-participation survey, the specific questions, and the risk stratification tool. And then that NCAA website is very good also, and they actually are, on their website, they're starting a series on the Female Athlete Triad, so I think just the first one is out. And it's the same author that wrote, I think the IOC, the IOC Consensus Statement. So they're all good resources. That's it. Ashley.
Hi, everybody. So again, my name's Ashley. I am the registered dietitian here at Fortius Sport and Health, and I do specialize in sports nutrition. I've been working with a few different groups of athletes emphasizing lean physique, such as figure skaters, gymnasts, dancers, for a few years. So over the years, I have had some experience working with individuals dealing with the female athlete triad, REDS, and in working with Dr. Forsyth. We've worked on a couple of cases together, so it's been good to have a bit of a team approach. So I just want to touch on the nutrition component. For the coaches out there, do you want to share what sports so there's cross-country skiing. What other sports have you? Kayak. Right, canoe kayak, okay. Running. Okay, great. Any other sports? Coaches? No? And have any of you, including any of the physicians, you guys have mentioned you've been working with athletes with these symptoms, but anyone else experienced this so far? No? Okay. Some of you, okay, good. Great, so hopefully we can give you a little bit more insight. And what I'm trying to do now is do a little bit more practical applications from a nutrition perspective and how we can help our athletes, or even your patients that might not be considered an elite athlete, but active individuals work through these conditions. So let me just start with what I'm going to do is just elaborate a little bit on what Sara was talking about with energy needs. And so there was an equation put up really quick, basically about resting metabolic rate and exercise energy expenditure, and equaling total daily energy expenditure. So what we're looking for here is both of these things. So resting metabolic rate is just the minimal amount of calories our bodies will expend at rest to keep internal organs functioning, plus exercise energy expenditure, so the amount of energy expended during sport or exercise or activities throughout the day. And we want that to equal the amount, so that is the total daily, that makes up our total daily energy expenditure. So in order to try to explain that a little bit better, I thought I'd use an example. So I was working with an ice dancer. So this ice dancer is age 14, 105 pounds. Her height is 5'4". She trains quite a bit, and if anyone has worked with figure skaters or ice dancers in the past, they do have a pretty regimented training schedule. So it's not uncommon to train 4 to 6 hours a day for them. So her total energy expenditure for this day example was about 2,800 calories in a day. So I calculated resting metabolic rate. It came out to about a range of, I'd say on average, about 1,250 calories in a day. Energy expenditure from her sport, anywhere from 1,250 to 1,450 calories in a day. So this is what her usual intake was. So usually when I sit down with an individual, I'll ask them certain questions, one of which being, what do you typically eat in a day? Or give me a 3-day food diary kind of thing, so I get an idea. So for breakfast, so you guys can look through it, but breakfast, fruit smoothie, looks great, banana, berries, some kale, yogurt, almond milk. Then she went in for on-ice training, had lunch, so had a big salad. In the evening, had a dance class, and then had a snack afterwards, just an apple. And then dinner had 2 cups of vegetables, half a cup of brown rice, 2 ounces of salmon. So what we were trying to, and I think what Sara was trying to say, is that with athletes, often they need way more than we think or an average person might need. So looking at that diet intake, it actually sounds like it's enough food through the day. They're eating through the day. It's not that they're not eating any food, but the total calories from that only adds up to 740 calories in a day. So that's quite low, even for someone who's not active. So basically, total energy was 2,800 calories through the day that expended. And if we subtract her actual energy intake, that leaves a 2,060 calorie deficit. So the energy available was 740 calories. Subtract the energy expended, there's a negative energy availability there. So that's when things start to go wrong. So the goal is for that to be equal, so that there's an equilibrium, or the weight is in balance. And you might not see any changes in weight, and we don't sometimes. But let's say, so what happened here was, after meeting with this individual, I looked at her usual intake and then had to encourage her to eat more throughout the day. This person was trying to lose weight. Sometimes in certain sports, even a coach will say you have to be a specific weight to compete. And so that person will do everything they can in order to achieve that weight goal without really realizing the negative effects on health. And it might not be a coach, it might be a parent, it might be self-inflicted, it might be that individual saying, I want to be this specific weight. So they're just trying to get there. They don't really realize necessarily that they're putting their health at risk. So with this individual, we worked together to create a diet plan where she was actually getting enough calories throughout the day. So that would look more like this. So breakfast, the smoothie plus a piece of toast with peanut butter. On-ice training, this was a longer session. So usually any sport over about 60 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes of training, I will suggest having a snack during exercise, because that's when energy reserves or glycogen reserves are low or depleted. So in order to improve performance, it is beneficial to have some kind of carbohydrates. So during your session, 1/3 of a cup of dried apricots. The snack within 30 minutes of finishing, chocolate milk and a banana. Then that salad, but adding in some protein and some starch, so a cup of roasted yam. Then goes to the ballroom dance class, and as a snack, a recovery snack from that class, not just an apple, but add in some protein, so the peanut butter and a bit of yogurt. And then dinner, so just a bit of a bigger portion size. So you can compare, so that, and also an evening snack, you can have strawberries and a little bit of dark chocolate. So if you compare that intake to this one, it's almost that she's eating at the same time through the day, there's just more foods, and it's a more complete meal. So you can kind of tell in this one that, she was restricting grains or carbohydrates a little bit. So there's no grain here, there's no grain here, there's a little bit here. Often I'll see that. That's kind of one of the warning signs that I'll look out for. If they're omitting a specific food group, I'll ask why. Or if somebody tells me, especially at a young age, that they're vegan and both their parents aren't, and when I ask why, they say it's to be healthier, that can be a little bit of a warning flag. So these are kind of the things that I would look out for.
I don't see much protein there for breakfast. There's no eggs or
in this one?
Or meat, yeah.
So the protein would actually come from Greek yogurt. That 3/4 of a cup of Greek yogurt actually gives, it's 20 grams of protein. So 1/2 a cup would be like 15 grams of protein. And then 2 tablespoons of peanut butter is about 8 grams of protein. So if you had 3 ounces of meat, you would get anywhere from 25 to 35 grams of protein. About 25.
30% of dairy protein is not digestible.
It's digestible. I mean, whey protein is actually one of the best, the quickest to digest. So that's why you'll see, like, protein shakes and protein powders are all based on whey, or a lot of them are. So you'll get the exact same, and they've done research studies looking at the difference between having a protein shake or having the protein from like a yogurt or like a dairy, and you get the same response.
So what percentage of the protein in yogurt are you saying is digestible?
I mean, pretty much all of it, as long as, yeah. If you go above, if you have more than about 20, it depends on body weight, but on average around 20 to 25 grams of protein in one sitting, there's a certain amount that can be absorbed and digested, and then the rest will either be absorbed as fat or will be eliminated from the body.
You're over that though with the 5 ounces of chicken and the 5
In
ounces of salmon.
In one sitting, right? So
at lunch, the 5 ounces of chicken would be 35 grams of protein.
So about there. Yeah, but I mean, they need the calories, so yeah.
Going back on that lady, the previous diet that you're showing, was she losing significant weight, or she was not?
No, not losing weight. So that's
not the normal diet. Like if she was 2,000 or 2,100 calorie deficient, she should be losing 2 pounds every 3 days.
No, so that's what happens is, and the body kind of tries to reestablish a balance by lowering.
1 or 2 days it will put up with it, though, but eventually the calorie you have to do the simple mathematical.
Not necessarily. Resting metabolic rate will adjust itself. So normally, there will be a specific, you'll be burning a specific amount of calories as your resting metabolic rate, but that RMR will drop if the body is not getting enough in. And we see it in athletes that we test where they're having problems losing weight, and it's not even a medical issue at that point, it's just that they're trying to lose weight, and so we're trying to see why, and they'll do a resting metabolic rate test, and it's lower than average, and then as soon as they adjust their diet and get the right amount of calories with a slight deficit, so maybe 500 calories a day of a deficit, that will bring their resting metabolic rate up, and they actually start to lose weight.
I'm not trying to disagree with you, but I'm trying to say this is a good diet though. But on that diet, if she she's going on extended period of time, there has to be results, not just on her weight, but on her total health.
Not always, no. But I see, but that is, I know what you mean with most people, and that is kind of common, that's what we think, common sense, but sometimes that...
3,300 calories are 1 pound of weight. That's how you have to count.
3,500, yeah.
3,500
Yeah.
to 300.
Right, so...
If she's deficient on a long period of time, something has to happen. But anyway, carrying on, sorry.
Sure. But yeah, we can talk further about that if you want at the end. So going back to the equations, so energy availability. So basically, for energy intake now is at 2,800 calories, and we subtract the amount of energy expended during training. She has about 1,450 calories available for all of her body, all of her requirements. So that meets her resting metabolic rate, which we said was around 1,350 or so. So she's getting enough to make sure that she's meeting all of her metabolic demands, right? So this is that's what we're aiming for. In some athletes, caloric requirements are much higher than 2,800 calories in a day. Like we had some basketball players in, and I was trying to get them to gain weight, and they needed 7,000 calories in a day. What they were expending was about 6,000 calories in a day. So, and it's quite common with cross-country skiers as well, to have quite high, and a lot of different sports do require quite a lot of calories in a day, and it's just we're not used to it. If we're not used to working with athletes, then it's a good reminder that these, people who are active do need more, and it's very easy for that individual to not realize how much they actually need in a day. So does that make sense more with the equations? Okay. So the goal would be to try to prevent this from happening at all, right? So to try to have healthy athletes who achieve their performance goals. So I guess what we're trying to get across is to really be aware of the risk factors and signs. And as coaches, you guys are working really closely with your athletes. As physicians, people turn to you for advice, so it's great that you're here. So being aware of these risk factors and signs is a great step. So educating your patients and athletes about the Triad or about REDS, or Relative Energy Deficiency in sport, would be great. So, emphasizing on making sure they understand what proper nutrition is for their sport and for health. Knowing for themselves, recognizing what the signs and symptoms are of the Triad, so that if they start to experience any, they know they can come to you for support. Consequences of the Triad. So like you were saying, you're working with athletes, sometimes it's really hard to get the message across to them, but really just continuing to try to educate them about what the consequences are, and possibly referring them outwards to somebody who can in more detail. So that's where, we're here to help. So contact a sports medicine physician if not here, somewhere in your area, or a sports dietitian in your area to educate athletes and to educate even parents of the athletes. So I just want to go over a little bit of the basics about proper nutrition as it relates to sport. If there's any questions, please let me know. Interrupt me as I go. But basically, this is what I usually tell if I'm giving a talk to a sports team or to athletes. I'll start with some of the basics, like always start the day with breakfast. Often there's training sessions in the morning, and it's so common for people just to skip skip fuel first thing and just run or go do their session. So it is really important to make sure they are getting breakfast because of the calorie requirements throughout the day. It's difficult to meet. And if you skip breakfast, it's even harder to meet. It's taking out one meal. So I usually try to get athletes to eat small, frequent meals and snacks throughout the day to fuel daily activities. And when I'm talking about athletes, I'm also considering people who are active in general, and never to eliminate a food group. There's so many fad diets out there. Whenever we hear, like paleo or I don't know, there's Atkins diet in the past, and anytime that there's a food group, an entire food group being eliminated, that's a warning sign. You don't want that. There's specific nutrients that come from different types of foods. So yes, we can decrease the consumption of specific food groups, but not necessarily eliminate it completely. Yeah.
I have a question. So I have an athlete who refuses to eat breakfast, and he swears that he just can't. He's one of those people who can't eat breakfast first thing in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, he's 6'1" and weighs 140 pounds. He's a long distance runner.
Okay.
And so he just says that's what he is. But I keep trying to encourage the importance of breakfast. Do you have any tricks?
Any tricks? So if it
encourage them.
Yeah. So tell them. I mean, keep bringing it back to their performance. Like, say you should try having breakfast compared to not having breakfast, and let's see where you're at, and see you'll probably feel more efficient when you're training, when you're running, right? And feel like it's less effort to do the same amount of work. And the other thing, and it does happen that some people are just not used to having breakfast. So if they eat something, they feel nauseous when they start to run. So say it's kind of like training. You have to train your stomach to eat. So at that time of day, so basically they can even start with a glass of juice and start there. And then they can work their way up to a fruit, work their way up to a fruit and yogurt. And then
he's up to a banana.
Oh, okay, that's good. That's a start.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
What do you say for someone who's working and who gets up at 6 a.m. and has to be back by 6:30 and get to work? Like,
okay.
Is that still essential for them to have something in their system before they do their exercise?
It is beneficial, and so I usually would recommend, even if you can wake up 20 minutes early, and have a banana, right? And that.
So you're just trying to get up earlier, maybe is the.
Yeah. If it's like a 30-minute run, then it's not as important as if it's a longer session. But even with a 30-minute run, I try to say even like half a banana 15 minutes before, a glass of juice 15, 20 minutes before should be beneficial. Yeah.
Why would it be beneficial? Because bananas maybe 120 calories, a glass of juice might be 90 calories. You could just guzzle that after your workout. It doesn't take much energy to
carbs,
take that in after.
Because carbohydrates, it's a good source of carbohydrates, right? That's the only nutrient that as soon as it's digested, it's right away converted to glucose, which is our body's primary and most efficient source of fuel. So it's kind of like saying you're going to drive a car without much gas in it and expect it to run perfect.
Doesn't have glycogen to do you for a 1 hour exercise anyway.
The glycogen reserves, I guess you could. I mean, it's not. It would just make it more. You'd feel more efficient at the sport. But it is, if you have to pick between having something before and after, having the recovery snack is definitely most essential. But I guess the 30-minute runs you can kind of get away with.
I just have empathy for high-performance athletes that are going to go out there and really go for it. And if you're doing a high-performance stuff, you don't want any food on your stomach, and you can wolf it down afterwards.
Why would you not want food in your stomach for high performance?
If you're going at 100% and you have something in your stomach, it's...
if it's digested, the sugars are in your blood system and it's just fueling you. It's just a matter of finding that right time to actually eat and have it digested and ready to be used as substrate and as fuel. But yeah, you don't want to have too much before because then it can cause GI disturbances, but as long as there's enough time, then it should be okay. Yeah. Any other questions? No? Okay, so just going through this, some more general rules. So basically try to emphasize a high carbohydrate diet with moderate amounts of protein and low to moderate amounts of fat. So what I like to say to people that's a little bit more real, I guess, on a day-to-day basis is when you're looking at your plate, for all your 3 meals, have half of your plate represented by vegetables or fruit, a quarter with protein, and then a quarter with whole grains. And this might shift a little if it's a high-performance athlete. So whereas the amount of carbohydrates, or sorry, the grains and vegetables or fruits are equal, and then it's about a third of the plate protein. All meals, so another way of thinking of it is all meals should have about 3 to 4 of the 4 food groups. So always including a serving of grains, vegetables, and fruits, and then also having some protein, whether that's from the meats and alternatives, so it could be meat, fish, nuts, seeds, beans, chickpeas, or it could also be a dairy product like we talked about, Greek yogurt, could even be a glass of milk, cheese, that would count as a protein as well. And then snacks, it is really important to snack through the day, especially for athletes. So all snacks should have at least 2 food groups. So often I'll see people say, yeah, I snack, but it's like, you know, they'll have a bunch of carrot sticks or maybe a few handfuls of crackers. So you want that to be a more complete snack where you have something providing carbohydrates, so let's say a fruit, for example, which gives you that energy, and then combine it with protein, because that's going to help you stay full longer and keep that energy lasting longer. So an apple with natural peanut butter goes a longer way than just an apple on its own. Or berries and yogurt, or veggies and hummus. The hummus acts as a protein. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So talking about what to eat before training or before practice or competition, as we were kind of getting into, so what you're going to be eating depends on how much time you have before starting. So those athletes that are training first thing in the morning, like 6 a.m., probably not going to wake up 2 or 3 hours beforehand and eat something, right? But you can encourage them to have something, even if it's like 15 to 20 minutes before, a glass of juice or half a banana, it's better than nothing. If it's, you know, an 8 a.m. practice and they're able to wake up an hour before, then maybe they can even stomach a light bowl of cereal or a piece of toast with some peanut butter on there. If it's an afternoon or an evening workout, try to encourage your athletes to have a full meal following that plate rule about 2 or 3 hours before, and then maybe even top up those energy stores with something that has a bit of carbohydrates about an hour, 30 to 60 minutes before. So that could be, it could be as simple as a fruit. It could be, you know, it could be like a smoothie like we were talking about. Just something, it doesn't have to be crazy, a bowl of cereal about an hour before, just to make sure they're topping off their stores and they have enough energy to keep them going. And I guess to kind of touch on that question of like glycogen reserve. So, you know, if you just rely only on your glycogen reserve, if it's an intense training session, once those reserves are depleted, then the body is going to start turning to internal stores of fat and muscle for energy. So then you're going to start losing, you don't want to lose muscle mass, because that's going to result in a loss of strength and endurance. So if we have glucose in the system to be utilized first, and then go into glycogen stores, it's going to be more efficient during the training session. They're going to feel better, more energy. Any questions about this? No? So during exercise, as I was mentioning earlier, after about 60 to 90 minutes of training, we do want to replenish those glycogen reserves, because that's when they start to drop. So providing 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour of exercise lasting longer than 60 to 90 minutes would be what I'd recommend. So these are just some examples of foods that provide 30 grams of carbohydrates, and it depends on the sport. So, you know, runners, you're probably not going to have a banana while you're running. But if it's something like, you know, maybe a soccer game and you have halftime, you could probably have maybe a few bites of that banana at halftime and then combine it with a couple other things. What I find works really well is having a sports drink, so that way you can get hydration, you can also get carbohydrates, and you can get electrolytes that you lose through sweat. So I actually have some handouts out here. On your way out, you can grab one, and there's a recipe for a homemade sports drink. It's basically just mixing half a liter of water with half a liter of 100% fruit juice, and then adding 1/3 of a teaspoon of salt in there. And that way you get sugars that come from natural sources of fruit rather than Gatorade sugars or, you know, Powerade sugars or whatever commercial sports drink that they purchase. So if you do have time, or if your athletes or anyone that you're working with has time, then that's a good recipe.
There's no potassium there, is that?
Yeah, the potassium comes in with the fruit juice, actually.
Fruit juice? Ah.
Yeah, and it gives you the exact range that you need. It's comparable to a commercial blend. So with any fruit juice, the potassium and then the sodium comes from the salt. So yeah, and then the carbohydrates would be at the right range as well. You don't want it to be too concentrated in sugar, because then it's going to create some GI disturbances. So it's really important to also place an emphasis on recovery nutrition. Basically, there's about a 30-minute window where our body can absorb glucose at the fastest rate stored in glycogen, stored in our muscle cells for later use. So that's only really important if there's 2 training sessions in one day. So if you have less than 20 hours until the next workout, then try to get something within the first 30 minutes of finishing exercise. Otherwise, your body will probably have enough time if you do have something within 2 hours. The other thing is during exercise, naturally there's protein that is broken down. And in order to stop that protein from being broken down, carbohydrates ingesting carbohydrates will stop that protein breakdown process. And if you consume protein as well, it starts initiating protein, like basically building again. So building that lean muscle mass or maintaining lean muscle mass. So some examples could be, I think you guys have heard of probably chocolate milk. That has actually the ideal ratio of carbohydrates to protein, which is about 3 to 1. And so that will help with rebuilding muscle mass. It'll help with just replenishing glycogen reserves as well for the next workout. So that's a good one. Other options are, I keep going back to some of the same examples, but like fruit and yogurt is a good one. It's best if you can get real foods, great. Then otherwise there are some bars out there, but looking at the bars, you don't want something that's just protein. You do want something that has more carbohydrates than protein. So I'm going to just switch now to strategies for weight loss. So if anybody is working with an athlete that is trying to lose weight, then maybe the question comes about, like, how do we get them to lose weight at a safe rate in order for them to not experience any of the symptoms of the triad, but to still achieve their performance goals. So it can actually be done while still maintaining adequate energy availability for optimal health and performance, so to prevent any of these symptoms from occurring. So I would say, usually I just say follow the same guidelines as usual. So still have something to eat every 2 to 3 hours, having those complete balanced meals and snacks through the day. But we're going to have to adjust the portion sizes. It's really important to make sure that they're always eating something before, during, and after their sport. That's when they really need to have the right nutrients and energy to fuel them and to recover properly. And they can adjust the portion sizes throughout the day accordingly in order for them to achieve their goals, other than especially right after or during sport. So this is kind of going back to that same, I guess, diet plan that I was showing you from the figure skater, the ice dancer, at a 500 calorie deficit. So that would allow this individual to lose 1 pound per week. And in someone that is already at a lower weight, or let's say it's an athlete, like a figure skater or a gymnast or even a runner, rock climber, if they're not overweight, then 1 pound of weight loss per week is a good rate. It's just that we need to plan ahead in order to do that. So if there's competitions coming up, knowing that that's going to be the rate of weight loss, that would be a good way to think about it. So, and it's just some slight adjustments. So it's still having, like I was mentioning, the right fuel before and after training. And then actually there would still be the dried apricots in there. But just adjusting the portion sizes so that they can see their goals, taking the dessert out, that kind of thing. That will allow that person to accomplish their weight loss goals and still stay healthy. So again, weight loss should not be rushed. So it's really important to allow for adequate time for athletes to achieve their body composition goals. If there are any signs of the triad, weight loss should be done with the help of a registered dietitian, specializing in sports nutrition if it's an athlete. Or even if you're working with someone who has been struggling with weight loss for a while and not getting there, seeing a registered dietitian is always helpful. That is what we do for a living, just focus on nutrition. So that's kind of everything I wanted to talk about today.